Okay, welcome to today's Council on Foreign Relations meeting. My name is Lee Brenner. I am the co-founder and publisher of Hypervocal.com, which is a next-generation news and media company. I also co-host a SiriusXM show called Politics Powered by Twitter, looking at how politics and policy have been altered, changed, and are affected by social media and what is playing in the prism of social media. So great to have you all today. We're going to talk about the future. Right, so we've got a lot to cover, but really focused on policy, technology, how those things interact. And we've got two great people with us. Joel Garreau, who's a Lincoln Professor of Law, Culture, and Values at Arizona State University, a future Tense Fellow at the New America Foundation. He spent almost 40 years at the Washington Post covering...
40.
Almost 40.
Almost 40,
right,
yeah, 40,
mm-hmm. And covering society and culture and how things were changing in this country and things are changing. We also have Michael Rogers, who's founder of Practical Futurist. Is one of the former titles, Futurist in Residence at the New York Times for a long time. It was a great title. But I'm going to ask each of them to just give a quick 1-minute overview of what they kind of are paying attention to, and then we can kind of jump into a conversation for a bit, and then we'll open it up to questions halfway through. So let's start first with Joel. Give me a sense of what you've been working on in terms of technology and policy.
Yeah. My area of interest is that we're at an inflection point in history. For the first time in hundreds of thousands of years, our technologies are not aimed outward at modifying our environment in the fashion of fire, clothes, cities, agriculture, space travel. Increasingly, these technologies are aimed inward at modifying our minds, our memories, our metabolisms, our personalities, and our kids. And if you can do all that, you're in the stunning position of being the first species to take control of your own evolution, not in some distant science fiction future, but right now on our watch. And I've written a book about this called Radical Evolution. And the technologies that are driving this, I call the GRIN technologies for genetics, robotics, information, and nano. And the significance of this is we're not just talking about the internet.
Michael?
One of the things I work with a lot of companies on now, that's sort of what I do now, is having worked for the Washington Post, Newsweek, and the New York Times on moving into the new century. I've declared victory there and moved on to help other corporations who have very similar issues. And what it all comes down to for services and information is what I call the virtualization of the world. That we are moving into a period of time that the best analogy I can think of is Lewis Mumford once wrote an essay called The Natural History of Urbanization, in which he pointed out that the move into cities for us happened very, very quickly as a species over about 1,000 years. And when we moved into cities, it was a fundamental shift in society for several reasons. One, we needed new business models and new laws to live together as opposed to sort of the family groups we had. Number two, it took us one step away from the source of our food. It was one step of abstraction away from the physical world. And of course, urbanization was an enormous shift. I think virtualization, which is the creation of a virtual world that runs parallel to the physical world in which we live all of the time, is the next big step after urbanization. And right now we're at the very beginning of virtualization. But what it means ultimately is that we will all be connected all of the time to the virtual world, 24 hours a day, either consciously through a new generation of devices or unconsciously through all of the objects around us. And just as urbanization really transformed society, our laws, the way we live, I think that virtualization will do the same.
Well, Michael, I think that's actually a great place to start. I mean, I was talking on the radio show actually recently about the Internet of Things, which is basically that concept of everything being connected that we use, your refrigerators, everything else that can tell you how to live your life. I guess a general question, is it a good thing for society in the sense that are we going to get to a point or are we coming very quickly to a point where there's going to be a major conflict in society, where there are people that are saying, we have to stop this, not necessarily conservative politically, but people say, look, this is moving too fast, or are things moving so quickly and it's just the way it is, where people are going to adapt and it is coming and people are going to learn to live with these technologies?
I think it's a combination of things. I think people are adapting to technology more quickly than they used to. And the example that I like to use is my banking clients will say it took an entire generation to teach people to use ATMs, automatic teller machines. We actually got the taking money out part pretty quickly, but the putting money in took about a generation, took about 20 years. Then I like to flash forward to the biggest dating site, Match.com. I once interviewed one of the founders of Match.com and asked him what he would have done differently if he'd known what online dating would become. And he said, I would have invested much more earlier, because he had no idea that online dating would go from something that was really pretty weird and risky to mainstream within 8 years. And then finally, Facebook. When Facebook launched in 2006, it was .edu, it was college students. Within 5 years, the fastest growing segment on Facebook was women over 55. So I think we're seeing an acceleration of the adoption rate.
Right. And some would say that last part is part of the reason that Facebook is no longer cool. At least for, not for the women part. No, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Let me finish. For cool for.
Dig your way out of this.
Cool for teenagers because their mothers are on the platform right now.
Yeah.
And so they're not adopting it. So they are just using mobile technologies. Didn't mean that.
Nothing worse than being friended by your mom.
Yeah. Right. No. And that's actually become now a cultural point. But so looking at that technology of things and the things people use, Joel, are we looking at the new technologies? There's now a generation that's just coming into adulthood that has never known life without the internet, right? And so they're coming out, and obviously anyone who's born now, internet means a completely different thing than even it means to these 18-year-olds. How does the technology change for kids today versus the way society? Are these going to be these rifts between adults of all different ages and children, and can that be remedied?
Well, my interest is in culture and values. Who we are, how we got that way, where we're headed, and what makes us tick. That's my thing. And I'm not as big a nerd as I might sound being up here, but I just walk up to the technology to see what light it reflects on human nature. I don't care about the gear per se. But one of the things that looks pretty clear to me is that technology moves faster than culture. There is a culture lag. And I guess everybody in this room knows what I mean when I say Moore's Law, right? This curve of accelerating change. Well, that's also true for now increasingly for biology and robotics and nano. And if the curve of accelerating change is going up like this, if our responses are more or less flat, like we're waiting for House Judiciary to solve our problems, well, we're obviously toast, right? Because the gap just keeps on getting wider and wider. I have an optimistic view of hoping that our responses will also come up on a second curve. But in the meantime, I think that the reason you're seeing more and more social weirdness, Tea Party, take notice, is that when, I'm really interested in that as a response, because I think what's going on is that the ground is moving beneath our feet. And that's, if anything, it's increasing. And I think when the ground moves beneath your feet, any sane primate looks for something solid to hang on to. And I think what you're seeing is people who are increasingly buying simple narratives that sound right. Of all the commentators, cable commentators and stuff like that, all of whom are offering simple narratives, which, by the way, are probably wrong. But they are something solid to hang on to, and that's what worries me. I think we got to accelerate our narratives.
Lee, let me follow up on, you used a phrase, the next generation. That is always a real hot button in any audience I'm dealing with. Even if I'm dealing with venture capitalists and we're talking about investments with 10-year time frames and the most technical stuff you can think of, afterwards there's always a question, what about these kids? And the fact is, the millennial generation, largest generation in American history, that's the one that is really growing up with technology. It's interesting, some researchers want to divide the millennials into two halves, the 10 to 20-year-olds and the 20 to 30-year-olds, and call the 20 to 30-year-olds senior millennials, which I love. Love to tell a 26-year-old they're now a senior. But the reason is because the whole relationship to the virtual world of the 10 to 20-year-olds and their younger siblings is so different. And that, to me, where is this going? And I have to say, this is one enormous science experiment, because we genuinely don't know what the effects are of growing up so attached to the virtual world, virtual relationships. But the virtual relationship piece, I think, is crucial. I think that this generation will grow up being able to create and maintain meaningful virtual relationships in personal lives and business lives that, in a way that the boomers just can't understand. And that will really change this notion of virtualization.
Well, and a general topic, almost, Joel, you were referring to this, is as technology advances very quickly and society may not necessarily be caught up to the speed at which it is moving, a general question could be, is the internet and technology making people smarter or dumber? And I was talking about that earlier, but on kind of an angle of that is, will the next generation, the young people who are growing up with this technology, because they are living with it from day one, will they be adapted so that their learning curve will be better and that they will be able to be smarter and help to use it constantly, compared then to, people can say, oh, the young people are actually going to solve all the problems here, but maybe they have at least more tools than people that hadn't grown up with this technology. And it's harder for them to adapt, even though they will be around for the next few decades.
I'd be happy with employed. I don't know if they're adapting. I don't really care. I just want them out of my basement. I have two daughters. They're both, and one of them is here, and they're both very happily employed. Thank you very much. God bless you, dear. But no, seriously. I mean, one of the things that I'm very worried about, I think we all are, is what happens if this time it is different? What happened? I mean, the people who, there's this whole argument that the Luddites were crazy because, their jobs were taken away, but they ended up moving to the cities and getting better jobs and blah, 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 which is all true. But meanwhile, they'd lost their jobs, and there was an awful lot of revolution and war and dead people in the course of what we now smooth out as this curve. And, I can easily imagine, all politics is local. So I was a reporter and editor at the Washington Post. And in 2009, I ended up having to take the last buyout of senior staff before the layoffs started because there is no business model. Now I'm in a university. If this happens to me again and that industry gets shot out from under me, I'm going to start taking this stuff personally. And I'm just very cognizant of the fact that the last time we had 25% unemployment in the first half of the 20th century, uniform National Socialism began looking good to a lot of people. Of course, so did the New Deal. But this could be some pretty heavy upheaval, and I imagine it'll start with the young.
What role does government play in that then? Because of potential technology advances which are replacing so many jobs and so much money is being put into, through venture capitalists, into technologies and companies that don't necessarily hire the same way that a General Motors and some of these other companies in the past did with similar market capitalization. What does the government have to do to make sure or to help people have jobs in the future?
Well, that's a very broad question, and it ranges from income redistribution, if necessary, because we may end up 30 years out a class of people who have a lot of time on their hands and are relatively well educated, and we don't quite know what to do with them. So income redistribution is one way to keep the revolution out of the streets. A second, though, is to be more realistic about what jobs will continue in the future and which won't. And I used this example when we were talking earlier. I just finished working with a group that represents plumbers, electricians, and heating and air conditioning contractors. And their problem is finding young workers, because the United States really focuses on everyone goes to a four-year college, gets a degree, and sits in an office. And those jobs are so easily automated or outsourced that it's a fiction almost. I work with legal firms now, and young lawyers are having a difficult time, partly because of outsourcing and partly because of automation. So the HVAC contractors want to bring a message to parents, school districts, and legislators that says, these are good jobs. Being a plumber can't be automated, and it can't be outsourced, and it's a perfectly dignified thing to do. One guy said to me, my son's friends all went to college, 4-year degree, came home with $40,000 in debt, and they live at home. A kid who went to work for me at the same time is buying his first house, thinking about getting married and having a kid. So we have to be more realistic about what jobs are really going to be there.
I mean, I think we're coming out of a phase, for the last 15 years or so at least, of kind of techno-utopianism. That this was all going to be great, and we were all going to solve, pain, suffering, stupidity, ignorance, death. And we're all going to. And there's still a bunch of people who believe that. A lot of them in Silicon Valley, and a lot of them in the U.S. government. One of the things you have to keep track of is the fact that just about all of this change that we're talking about was financed by the U.S. government. Steve Jobs, that whole myth about the garage. I mean, he was a packager and a designer. I mean, and a great one, don't get me wrong. But every single technology in your smartphone was created by the US government, from Siri to GPS to the touch screen to all of this. These are the guys, DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, where I was embedded for a year. I mean, I'm really struck by not yesterday's news about information technology, but tomorrow's news about biology, which is where DARPA just launched a new directorate, BTO, Biological Technologies Office. It's very rare for them to create a new directorate. And the reason they finally did was because they had so many biology programs going across their other directorates that they finally had to create one place for it to get all of these things into one place to try to get their arms around it. And the kind of, I commend it to your attention. Go to the DARPA website and go to BTO and look at what they're doing there. It's pretty, they haven't gotten the memo yet. They're still very optimistic. One of the things that they're doing is a program called Living Foundries, 1,000 molecules. Well, what this is about is that at Arizona State University in biodesign, which is a big biotechnology lab, for example, on the roof, we've got creatures that eat CO2 and poop gasoline. Seriously. And thereby solving the Middle East and climate change, hopefully in the near future. Well, the way you do that is, there are 27 chemical steps to go from carbon dioxide to crude equivalent. And they all occur in nature, but not in one creature. So what you do is you take these 27 steps, genetically stitch them together into one bacteria or algae, and bam, you've got crude equivalent. Well, what DARPA is working on right now in the Living Foundries business is creating 1,000 novel molecules that you've never seen before, novel materials, essentially in the same way. And the list of what they're working on, there's another one called Prophecy. That's another one of their current things, which is about biological invulnerability. There's another one called Biochronicity, which, among other things, is meant to reverse aging. Now, check out the DARPA website. Check out BTO. Now, the interesting thing to me is also about the reaction to all this is also largely government funded so far. Like, for example, when it comes to, one of my big things is ethics. I'm an ethics professor. And when it comes to some of the people that are most ahead of this is like the Navy, for example. I give them tons of credit. Over here in Annapolis and over on the West Coast, they've got lethal autonomous robots. They've got robots that do not need a human to pull the trigger. They're called smart mines. These smart mines register whether it's an enemy ship or not, and then they decide whether to blow it up. And because the Navy has this problem, right? Because you can't push electricity very easily through water, so that they have a hard time communicating with their robots. So they are in the forefront of creating ethical robots. Are they going to succeed? I have no idea. Am I glad somebody's working on it? You bet.
What role, some of these things that are being created, and obviously I assume the DARPA website doesn't have everything they're working on, most likely. But
you'd be amazed, actually.
They have a lot. But in the sense of the things that they're creating, obviously there's plenty of practical uses and some things people haven't thought of, but for medicines and science and all these things that can help humanity. But obviously then there's the other side of things where they may be creating molecules that they don't necessarily know exactly what it'll turn into 30 years from now, what the body will react to it. What role, Michael, what role do you think the media has in shaping cultural and societal opinions about these types of things? I mean, how important is there a media anymore that actually has that role in terms of shaping opinion, or is it so democratized that there isn't necessarily those cultural icons in media?
I think we're going through a period now where media is being reinvented, and that the kind of sort of scientific journalism, which is really what's necessary to understand a technology, you need to understand some of the science behind it, and there's a long, great tradition of science journalism in the United States, but there are fewer and fewer places that can support that kind of journalism. We have a big hole, and we're not quite sure how we're going to fill it. And I often say that the last century was the golden age of journalism, not because we did such great things, but because we had so much gold. When you were a monopoly and you owned the printing press or the broadcasting tower, you made so much money, you really did, that we invented this church-state relationship in the media. In other words, they made so much money that the business people actually didn't care what we reporters did that much. We'd upset the local car dealer maybe, but he wouldn't advertise for 6 months, but he'd come back. So we invented this church-state relationship that did some amazing journalism because they basically let us do whatever we wanted. And there was great science journalism. I mean, probably going back to the 70s was one of the times that the specter of genetic engineering came up. That was an invention of recombinant DNA, which is basically the underpinnings of many of these technologies today. And there was a conference of scientists to talk about the threats and possibilities of it. Very thoughtfully reported by dozens of newspapers. Their craziness appeared, but the craziness actually sort of got damped down. I don't think there's an equivalent to that today, and we need to solve that problem.
And there's been tons of discussion about the role of the size of government, regulation, and a lot of these things. And obviously, people, you mentioned Tea Party, but there's a lot of people who say government needs to be smaller, but with a smaller government, they don't necessarily create all of these advances that people don't know are part of their phones and all these other things. And then the other side of that is, what role does the government have in regulating the Steve Jobs creation that actually repackages or advances something that the government has created? And then we can obviously talk a little bit about data and everything else that's going on. But what role generally do you think government has in regulating? And then are there people in government that are focused on that? Because oftentimes government is not as advanced as DARPA is probably the most advanced, and the rest of people that are actually regulating aren't as advanced.
Well, for my sins, I attend a lot of conferences on this subject, and I think it's doomed. This comes, if you think that culture moves slower than innovation, well, then comes regulation and Washington and all that. I mean, you go to these conferences with all these people, and they act as if it's possible to. One of the things I'm interested in is, how do you govern technologies that don't exist yet? That's one of my core interests. That's why I'm in the law school. And they're talking about spending 5 or 10 years to regulate technologies that are already 5 or 10 years old. I see nothing good coming out of that. I just have a lot of trouble. I'm a congenital optimist, so I'm hoping that what replaces this industrial age kind of mechanistic reg writing which I view as hopeless is, I'm wondering what happens if you end up with, how do you accelerate the curve of human response? My hunch is that the way you would do that is in a bottom-up, flock-like way. I think the idea of top-down, hierarchical stuff is just not fast enough. That's nothing wrong with it in the abstract. It's just not fast enough. So, what I'm very interested in is when you see, for example, DIY biology, do-it-yourself biology coming up, which is happening, and people stitching stuff together for fun. I'm going to be very interested to see what kind of ethics and morals evolve fast around that in a bottom-up way. I've got a lot more optimism about the people who are doing it, coming up with ways to make sure we don't destroy the human race than I do in the FDA, frankly.
And is that a question then of, is there going to be self-regulation that'll take a bigger role than government, where maybe you have crowdsourcing on everything from fundraising and ideas, but is that maybe a sense where there'll be much more lower government walls and there'll be much more crowdsourcing of regulation?
Depends on what you mean by regulation.
Self-regulation often makes me nervous because it's not the little guy who's doing the self-regulating, it's the big corporations. Right. Let's take, for example, the regulation of the internet within the United States. The internet was launched by DARPA, but it was essentially invented by university professors. It was DARPA money, but guys at Stanford, and it's mostly guys, and UCLA, invented this thing in the late 60s where their biggest goal was to see that an email went from Palo Alto to Los Angeles. That was a triumph. And I went to school in Silicon Valley, and I know some of these guys. And once over beers, one of them said, if we had known what the internet was going to turn into, we never would have built it the way we did. Because it's utterly insecure. It's hopelessly insecure. It's the Wild West. So one of the things I think we're going to see in a narrative in terms of government internationally over the next decade is the rule of law on the internet. And one of the countries that is resisting that the most is the United States. We've been very laissez-faire about the internet and the whole virtual world, which was a good thing for a while, but now we have such powerful constituencies, the internet advertising companies, Google, Facebook, gigantic lobbying interests that are still doing their best to keep the internet from being regulated. It's interesting, a lot of the best thinking, I believe, about privacy, data retention, things like that is going on in Europe, because they are not hindered by the enormous lobbying efforts in the United States towards self-regulation.
I think some of the most interesting conversations in the United States that's going on about biology is occurring in the sports pages. All technologies are always adapted first by wherever you see the greatest competition. And so it's not too surprising that when you're talking about human enhancement, enhancing human cognition, human memory capabilities, aging, the whole deal. I mean, coming up with version 2.0 humans, all of which is in the works. Where this conversation is being the most thoughtful is in the sports pages, where you're asking whether Barry Bonds should go around with an asterisk on his forehead for the rest of his life because he's not the same kind of human as Willie Mays, his godfather, who's, and all those people whose records they broke. We're having a nuance. I mean, it's not all, it's not all knee-jerk. You're having nuanced conversations there where people are saying, on the one hand, well, all people want to see is spectacle, and if you can hit more home runs, mazel tov. And other people are saying, but wait a minute, what about, is that moral? I mean, the whole narrative behind sports is about human competition and about excelling and becoming more yourself and blah, blah, blah. And what happens if you just become a machine that has got a great pharmaceutical crew? I suppose that's what it turns out to be. We're having that conversation right now in a bottom-up way, and I think that's a lot smarter and more interesting than most of the regulatory efforts that I've seen here in Washington.
Although I might add they're aimed at regulation, which is at least sort of private regulation, which is how do you regulate what an athlete is allowed to do to their body.
Well, see, this is what I meant by regulation.
Yeah.
What do you mean by regulation?
Right.
If you're talking about FDA, I think that's hopeless. If you're talking about deciding what is okay and what is not okay in terms of narrative, and what I will buy a ticket for and what I won't, already there's I don't expect, for example, to see human cloning anytime soon. Not because it's not technologically possible, of course it is, but because there's been such a revulsion to it, even more so than to GMOs. Now, if you count that kind of bottom-up narrative as regulation, that's where I end up being a little bit more optimistic.
Right, and the other interesting point is that we don't really think about these technologies until we see examples of what they can do. And as you say, sports is where it first happens. And we think about these in the abstract and we become overwhelmed. But when the specifics come along, I'm a little optimistic about the human character.
All right, well, we're going to actually open it up and invite audience members to join in this discussion. Please wait for the microphone and speak directly into it. State your name and affiliation, and keep your questions and comments concise to allow as many attendees as possible to speak. So I will start calling on people. Back in the green, in the back.
In the green, Julia Moore from the Pew Charitable Trust. And if I could just say that the web was also supported by the National Science Foundation and not just DARPA, small commercial. But the real question is, I have really no faith in either bottom-up or top-down regulation. But I think there's a middle ground, like the Human Embryonic Fertilization Authority in Great Britain. And I wondered if either of you were familiar with that model and whether you think that that might, in fact, be a way for the future.
Never heard of it. Sorry.
It's an sort of semi-institutional. Yeah.
Not to hog the microphone, but the first test tube baby, Louise Brown, was, of course, born in Britain. And the British had something called the Warnock Commission and have developed an authority over human embryonic fertilization and other genetic issues that is made up of a public board that is very carefully selected and largely reflects the general ethics, if you will, of the British population, and has kept up very well with the science, has changed with the science, and really, I think, is a model that we should take a look at here more in the United States.
Yes.
I'm Mitzi Wertheim with the Naval Postgraduate School. I'm impressed with what you're saying because I grew up with parents that were always way ahead of the technology. The dilemma I find is human beings have great difficulty. I mean, change is really hard. The younger kids are going to live in a world that's going to be very easy for them until things change. I mean, there was a wonderful article in Scientific America the other day that I was reading about how the brain, basically, the first thing you lose is learn is the easiest thing for you to keep going back to. So you've got this question of adaptation that is here. Another thing that I think is terribly important, which gets back to your journalism thing, is training people to be able to tell stories. And we don't do that. That's not considered a very important skill in our educational system. And on the other hand, if you can't tell stories, how can people figure out really what these alternatives are? I too worry about all this mechanization in our lives. And also the question of jobs, we're going to have to rethink what work is or what people will get paid to do. The other day I saw some people picking up stuff on the street wearing red vests. And I went up and said, thank you for doing that. We really need people doing it. You've got to find a way to give people respect for doing a lot of work that we wouldn't want to do. And machines aren't going to change that. But I think it's desperately needed.
Yes, gentleman in the back.
Jeff Smith at the Center for Public Integrity. Joel, Lee, Michael, could you address this question? Are we headed for the dystopia portrayed by Dave Eggers in The Circle, inevitably, and how can we avoid it if we want to?
Oh, thank you for that. This is my hobby horse, thank you. So I don't make predictions. I don't have a crystal ball. I don't know anybody who does. I'm still waiting for my jetpack. What I do is scenarios, which are systematic, rational, logical stories, narratives about what the future might be like given the facts that we've actually got on the ground right now. And when you talk about human enhancement and that, you basically end up with heaven, hell, and prevail as the three scenarios. The heaven scenario, the curve goes straight up. You conquer pain, suffering, stupidity, ignorance, death. We merge with our machines. We all live happily ever after, and it's utopian. This is the Ray Kurzweil Memorial scenario and the Singularity University. Might happen. Perfectly credible. It's mapping Moore's law onto the future. The hell scenario is the mirror opposite. You have the same rapid change, but it gets into the hands of madmen or fools, and we wipe out the human race in the next 2 days. Again, a perfectly credible, believe me, this is a perfectly credible scenario. And it's the one that most people most easily identify with. I guess we had a lousy 20th century. Anytime you say it's all going to go to hell, everybody says, yep, you got that straight. But the third scenario is not the one I'm predicting, but it's the one I'm rooting for, and that's Prevail. And Prevail is not some middle ground between the heaven and hell. Heaven and hell are both techno-deterministic, meaning that they both assume that what matters is how many transistors you can get to talk to each other, you know, in the basis of Moore's law. Prevail is way over in its own territory because it's got a fundamentally different proposition, which is maybe what happens is, maybe what matters is how many ornery, cussed, imaginative, surprising humans you can hook up. There's reasons for guarded optimism that the human connection is what matters. You look out at the future of the human race from 1200 AD, you see marauding hordes, you see plague, and you say, okay, it's over for this species. 1450, you get movable type in the printing press. All of a sudden, you got a brand new way of storing and sharing and collecting and distributing your ideas, and the results are amazing. First, you get the Renaissance, and then you get the Enlightenment and the world we got today. Lots of examples like that. And there are a lot, and throughout our literature and our stories, we got a lot of Prevail stories. So the question I'm asking myself is, can we figure out a way to accelerate this second curve of human response in a fashion, in an identical way to the way DARPA accelerates the first curve of technological challenges? And I've launched something called the Prevail Project, which is intended to see if we can do exactly that. And in that scenario, you ask yourself, how would you know if the Prevail scenario was happening? And I would guess that what you'd see is a lot of increased pace of out of nowhere, bottom up, flock-like, unexpected things. Have we seen that much lately? Well, of course, you know, what about eBay? That's not just the world's biggest flea market. That's hundreds of millions of people doing very complicated things without leaders. What about Facebook? What about Twitter? I have no idea what Twitter is good for, but if it flips out every tyrant in the Middle East, I'm interested.
Yes, in the bow tie.
Hi, my name is Jake Nelson from Yale University. My question is about the relationship between technology and truth. And I think coming from the millennial generation, I guess if I can take that label on, thinking of a highbrow example and maybe a lower brow example of maybe going to Wikipedia and assuming that something that you read is true, or thinking on the other hand of some of the more recent developments like Vox and 538 and these sites that attempt to either use data or use very sort of simple ways to depict very complex situations and affecting the way in which people understand what's going on, and sort of this idea of very sort of boiled down, simple models masquerading as truth, and if that's related to the technology or if it's important to think about as we continue to look at the role of technology.
I think we're seeing a fundamental shift in communications skills, and it's just starting now, but this is one of the more controversial things I say, particularly in audiences like this, but I do believe we're coming to the end of widespread long-form reading and writing over the next couple decades, that those skills will be in very rapid decline. And the fact is, it's because you don't need to read and write that much to get a lot of information about the world. I tell the story of my mother, a second grade teacher, long ago, who, if a little boy didn't know how to read, didn't get the reading thing, she'd find out he was interested in antique cars, and she'd bring in some books on antique cars, and he'd start going through them, and lo and behold, he's a reader. He doesn't need to look at books now. He can see all the videos and audio and slideshows about. And so we see that. We see long-form reading, and by that I mean anything over about 200 words, reading and writing declining very, very, very fast, because it's simply not going to be necessary. And I think what we don't understand is what that does to thinking processes, to what extent the thinking process is formed by learning to read. But in my more dystopian moments, I say that out around 2025, 2030, we will look back with some humor on these days when we used to look for kids with reading disabilities, because we will understand that reading was not a natural skill to begin with. Now, in 2025, we'll look for the kids with reading abilities. And just like star athletes, we'll say, okay, we're going to teach you to read and write really well. So I think that's why we're starting to see this world of boiled down jargon journalism or graphic journalism. And I don't think it's a good thing.
Can I just build on that for a
No,
minute?
please.
That's a scary scenario. One of the things that as a professional storyteller, I note that storytellers have been getting the best piece of meat around the campfire for an extremely long time. And that, I don't expect that to change in the future because that's such a hard, we're pattern-seeking storytelling animals. That's who we are. Rather than look up into the night sky and deal with the fact that maybe all those bright dots are random distribution. No, we come up with the most amazing stories about bears and princesses and lions and swords and so forth. We just can't stand the possibility that's random and we create stories instead. If that were to change, if all of a sudden we were no longer the storytelling species, that would be a profound shift in what it means to be human. And it's one that I would have a hard time, I have a hard time writing that scenario over the next 20 or 30 or 40 years. My problem is that it's getting the best piece of the meat around the campfire. Rewarding the storytellers is the challenge. And that's where I could imagine seeing a really dark, I agree with you, a really dark next 10 or 20 years before the next business, between the collapse of the old business model, which has occurred already, and the rise of the new one. But to say that there is not going to be storytelling as part of the human species in important and rich and complex ways, wow, I don't want to think about that scenario. I just have I have a hard time with that.
Although maybe storytelling, I think, will always exist. I think it's just the platform may change,
Yeah,
where someone will
exactly.
learn how to, they may tell, an entire novel will come out in 140 character bursts, and Nike will decide.
Really believe that?
Oh yeah, and Nike will decide, listen, they've got 12 million people following them. I actually will pay this person to keep doing that, and they can put an ad for Nike every once in a while. Maybe I'm not saying that's the entirely new concept or model, but maybe that's an area. Yes, you had it.
Thank you, gentlemen, for your conversation. My name is Wendell Ajiti, and I'm with Humanity in Action. Your comments on unemployment in this country I found incredibly pregnant, given that there's a surplus of labor in this country and a very robust and active carceral state, which ensnares overwhelmingly black bodies and some brown bodies too. So I'd love to hear your insight on incarceration, millennials, and surplus labor in this country. Thank you.
Well, I think Mitzi said something earlier on that was a good point, which is we need to do two things about finding jobs for people. One, we need to give sort of service work more dignity, and we probably need to pay more for it to give people truly living wages. It's not unlike the early days of factories when the factory workers went in and they didn't make much money at all, and it was not until unionization and suddenly they were the middle class, and the middle class drove our economic engines. Now it's pretty clear that service workers are going to be driving, those are going to be the jobs, they're going to be driving the economy, but not if they make $7 an hour. So incarceration, I think, is what you try to prevent, and we really need to relook again at the nature of work in society, I think.
If I could just add to that, again, if you're looking at at the technology that's aimed inward at modifying what we are as humans, like cognition and memory and all that jazz, you can pretty easily imagine scenarios in which, in the not too distant future, we end up with at least three different kinds of humans: the enhanced, the naturals, and the rest. The enhanced are the ones who embrace these technologies and who, and for them and for their children, and who every 6 months it's something brand new. I mean, I've got some of this stuff in my pack, things like Provigil that shuts off the human trigger to sleep. It exists, FDA approved. So you can end up with more and more enhanced humans that jump at this, and their kids are the ones who end up being smarter and better able to get into the best colleges and so forth, and you have to decide how you feel about that. Then there are the naturals. These are the ones who do have access to these technologies, but they choose to not to indulge, like today's fundamentalists who eschew modern pleasures. And then you have the rest, and these are the people who do not have access to these technologies for reasons of geography or class or whatever. That could get real ugly real fast. It's been a long time since we've seen more than one kind of human walking around at the same time. 25 or 40,000 years, depending on how you read the fossil evidence. You know, if we all of a sudden start, I wondered, you look at some of our wars right now, you know, you look at Afghanistan and you look at our war fighters versus the people from the, you know, who essentially haven't changed a hell of a lot since the 14th century. And you say, wow, is this what it looks like? Is this the beginning? Scary scenarios.
Yes.
Hi, Eben Kaplan from Control Risks. You've talked about regulation with respect to emerging technologies. I wonder about safety and security that goes beyond regulation. You mentioned the ability of madmen to wipe out the human race in 2 days. Whether it's a madman or somebody who makes a mistake, how do we create safety valves or law enforcement or security services that can prevent such an accident or deliberate act from happening?
I'm real pessimistic about police forces doing this. I'm much more optimistic about, my cockeyed optimism is based on on what bottom-up flock-like surprising solutions look like. So for example, if you had told, 30 years ago, if we had said that in the year 2014, every day, every second of every day, our most important computers that regulate everything from our, everything in the world would be attacked by the most incredibly malicious and imaginative and sophisticated pieces of software, bugs and worms and everything, we would, in the 70s, you would have said, okay, it's over for this species, we're toast, right? So, but now, in fact, what's happened is that, without really a hell of a lot in the way of government regulation, we've developed bottom-up responses, and there are entire industries that designed to scan. I'm not saying it's perfect. I'm just saying they exist. Don't get me wrong. I'm not suggesting that any of this is a panacea. I'm just saying I'm a student of good enough solutions. And in this particular, using this by analogy, you've got good enough. Does everybody's credit cards get stolen? Sure. Do we indict half the Chinese military? Sure. Is this a perfect solution? No. But it's not the catastrophe that you would have imagined had I given you this scenario in the 70s. So, this species has a history of muddling through. That's part of what Prevail is all about, is heroic muddling through, like Huckleberry Finn, like Exodus in the Bible. Those are all Prevail stories. And so that's the question I've got is, can we imagine scenarios where we have heroic muddling through? Maybe that's what Control Risk does for a living.
Can I just, a couple of quick thoughts on regulation. The first is in the life sciences. I think we have seen some pretty good self-regulation. Just recently over, for example, what to do with the final smallpox virus, the modified bird flu question. Within the scientific community, there is the roots of some self-regulation that we've seen over the years and is not a bad thing and works. I think when it gets into the capitalist system, self-regulation begins to break down. Look at General Motors. There were a bunch of engineers who knew that too heavy a keychain would cause the driver to die, right? But that never got reported because it was going to cost 18 cents more per switch to fix it. So there's regulation, but it can be overcome very easily by economics. The second piece is, when it comes to the internet specifically, I think that this is a case where we will see much more global activity. Right now, it's very disparate. We've got autocratic countries controlling parts of their internet. We've got the United States being quite laissez-faire. Ultimately, I think we're going to move towards some elements of a more international set of guidelines. One thing I think we're going to see is internet passports, some ability to have a real identity on the internet. It's astonishing that such an important thing doesn't have legal identities at this point. And every country is sort of working on how, all the Western democracies at least, are working on how you make a legal identity, probably with some biometric, that when you enter into the virtual world, we're pretty sure we know who you are. Sure, it's spoofable just the way a passport or driver's license
Putin's going to
is.
love that.
Yeah, well, that's why the Americas are being so careful about it, because, of course, national ID is a third rail. But these won't be IDs that you have to use all the time, just the way a driver's license. But if you'd like to get on an airplane, it's really handy to have a driver's license. So I think real identities on the internet are going to be a big step forward.
And meanwhile, the most effective regulators we've got are the leakers.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, you know, in the last year, now that we've learned what the NSA does for a living, that's made more difference than the entire regulatory apparatus of Washington, D.C., I would argue.
And you still have regulators who, and I won't name names, but say 99% of scientists are wrong on certain things.
Yes.
And they admit it.
Right.
That's part of the deal.
Right. Yep.
So my name is Sarah, and I work for Hewlett-Packard. So my question is about the IT industry, and what can you say about the ability of the industry in terms of meeting people's needs today and being ahead of the pack and where it's going, and how does this fall into your vision of the future under the different scenarios? How helpful is this industry? What else do you think?
The IT guy.
Well, I think the IT industry is absolutely crucial in the sense that to talk about the scenarios, we are, running into a lot of challenges between now and 2050, given the population increase that's inevitable, the move towards sustainability, which we're really going to need to have, and move away from the constant growth notion. IT, the combination of a global network, smart objects, very intelligent software of the, say, IBM Watson class that is able to really look at a lot of data and come up with novel solutions to problems, I think is enormously helpful. In terms of the whole world, I know analysts in the telecom industry who seriously say that by 2020 or 2021, absolutely everyone on the planet can have a phone if they want, which is an amazing, amazing concept. It's a combination of very low-cost Chinese hardware and really the Indian business model that lets you sell mobile service to people who earn $2 a day and make a profit. So, Pakistan, just the other day, was one of the last countries to approve 3G networks. So a lot of those people by the early 20s are going to have smartphones and be connected to the internet. It's really going to happen. It's hard for us to imagine how transformative that will be. But I think IT, along with smart approaches to biology, but biology takes a little longer. IT, I think, can make positive changes very, very quickly.
Can I just build on that for a minute? In your question is embedded the notion that information technology is a thing, a separate thing, that is somehow distinct from nanorobotics, genetics, ordinary life, I wonder about that. I mean, everything that we seem to be heading towards is smaller, more ubiquitous, more. And if we're not carrying it on ourselves personally, knowingly, we're being watched by somebody else who's got a reason to do that for us. And when it becomes that ubiquitous, when the chair becomes smart, when the water glass becomes smart, is it useful to think of that as information technology, or is this a new state of being? And how does Hewlett-Packard make any money off this?
Well, and then the question is who controls all of the information, whether it's just individuals, the government, the companies themselves. I think we probably have time for one more question. Before we take it, I just want to remind all participants that this meeting has been on the record, so everything you've said will be held against you in a court of law. Yes, in the white jacket.
I'm Emmy Probasco. I'm with the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Lab. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the education of policymakers on the state of the science and scientists on the state of policy, and how you would advocate that we make sure there's not a gap between the two communities.
A good final question.
I'm less interested in regulation than I am in ethics, frankly. We're at this stage, we're at this amazing point in history where we can do just about anything with material science, with energy, and with even biology. When you can do just about anything, then the core question is what you should do. And that's the core question of ethics. And in my optimistic moments, it's because I'm seeing more people asking, given the opportunity to do anything, what should we do? And that's why I'm glad to see government entities like the military, like the Navy, like our foreign policy establishment, asking more should questions. And if you can arrive at what we should do, arrive at some consensus or even some novel thoughts about that, that strikes me as being much more important than writing the regs.
I think it needs to, I think it's a really interesting thing that can start in scientific education. One example is, for the last few years, I've gone to Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory. For those of you who follow genetics, you know that was sort of the wellspring of a lot of interesting work. And just to talk to some of the graduate students about how society and science and the media sort of work together. And that's a direct connection, I think, to policy making there. But it's a little like I think as science and technology affect us more and more quickly, that should be a part of the curriculum. And we're sort of seeing that shift now in medicine, for example. Medical school educations are a more holistic approach. Journalism educations now include entrepreneurialism, so you can go out and figure out how to make a living. So educations are shifting, and I think the scientific education should as well. And I think it's got to come from that side. I think the policymakers, it's hard. You need someone to go to them. They don't necessarily come to you.
Are you seeing enough of that conversation happening? I mean, they should be doing it, but is enough of it happening to make the most necessary changes, at least from the policymaker side?
I'm seeing some, like for example, again, generalizing from a university of one, this biodesign at Arizona State University is 350,000 square feet of creatures that do not exist in nature. They're out there. And increasingly, you're seeing people who are embedded in biodesign who are in the ethics game. And an example is, for example, some woman scientist was involved in learning everything there was to know about some disease, and for which there was no cure. And the ethicist said, would there be something interesting for you to do that might involve a molecule or an organism for which we could create a cure? I don't mean to dump on scientists, but this is so classic. It had never occurred to her. I mean, scientists do not wake up in the morning thinking about how they're going to change the human race. They wake up in the morning thinking about how they're going to wire the goddamn monkey. They don't read news, they read journals and stuff like that. And the idea of opening up their world to a much larger consideration of the impact of what they're doing is, I think, crucial, and I think I see it happening.
Slowly. But,
it has to be fast enough.
In the IT world right now, one of the big questions is net neutrality. The FCC, Tom Wheeler is dealing with this. I am pretty convinced that the FCC is hearing all sides of the question. I mean, we have advocacy groups on every side. Some of them are a lot richer than the others. But all sides of the argument are being brought to the FCC. I mean, I'm comfortable with that. Can the regulators do the right thing? There probably isn't a right thing. Can they do something that causes the least damage? I think that's probably the case.
At least in the short term.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely. All right, well, I think we are at our end. I want to thank our panelists, Michael and Joel, for joining us. Thank you all for attending.